you've been furloughed from
Delta,
and you're looking for a job.
running Fulton County. Well, got a job at Fulton County Airport, running that school.
You were the airport director. Manager. Were you the airport manager at Fulton?
No, Fulton County had their own manager,
Okay.
and that was the source of the problem there. I stayed there for a year, a little over, and having so much trouble with that guy, whose name was Dick Adderhold. I'll say it now. He was a terrible manager, and he knew it. He apologized all the time, but he was also personal friends, and I think invested. And there was another operator on Fulton County. There were two operators there, and Cecil Adderhold was a friend of his, and they started doing things that were totally unacceptable from safety. We put up with it from just a business standpoint. For instance, there were no unicoms in those days, and a guy came around selling unicoms, a new idea, and I thought it was a good idea, so I offered to buy one if the other operator would share half of it, would use the unicom, for the airport, and he wouldn't do it. So I said, well, I'm going to buy it anyhow. So we bought the unicom and put an antenna on our hangar, and we're operating it for a little while there, a couple of months maybe, and one day a guy showed up and just had a hat on, and kind of a little short guy, and said, your name Jack Dunn? I said, yep. And he grabbed my arm about here and said, come on with me. And I said, where? He said, to jail, of course. And I said, what do you mean to jail? What's this about? He said, he finally took a little while to tell me, but he said that we've had a federal complaint about you operating a unicom improperly, using it to support your business or encourage your business, and telling the taxiing airplanes when they land to come to your pit instead of the other operator's pit. He sold gas, we sold gas, and he was always doing things that related to that. For instance, there was a T, there was no tower at the field, but there was a wind T, and it was tied down in 4 positions depending on the runway. And because he was friends with the airport manager, the airport county supplied him and his crew with a Jeep, a fire Jeep. It had fire equipment on it, and their job, one of the jobs, was to go out and change the T if the wind changed. But it's pretty tricky. 2 runways like this, and the T's in the middle here. And this runway is, if you land on this runway, you had to go by his gas pit first. Then you could go on by and get to mine. But any other way you landed, this way or this way, you had to go by my pit first. So I had the advantage, I guess you could say. And so they would put the T on this runway only. If the wind was over here, that's too bad. The T was this way, so everybody landed that way. And we watched that for a while and decided we couldn't stand that. On no wind days, it wasn't important, but if it was strong wind, well, one of the things happened. One day it was on this runway, and one of my customers took off in an L5, and engine quit right on takeoff, and he hit a hill on the other side. Didn't kill him, but it sure tore up the airplane, and he was in the hospital for 6 months. And that I think that was the thing that broke the straw for us. And I went to the Fulton County Commission, and that handled the lease situation for us, and started complaining about all this operation by the manager and the other operator. And they listened to me, but they didn't pay any attention because they were county, and they were all county together. So another case of business and politics. You just can't, things go on you don't believe. And so, and I was complaining about this operator and said he's got to stop that. Let us at least have half the time on a Jeep to set the T half the time, or somebody to monitor this and be sure it's into the wind. Something's got to be done safety-wise. And they said okay, and I went away. And next week I got a notice said your lease is canceled. So that was the end of Fulton County for me. And so let's see, Fulton County. Oh, well, it's just coincidentally at just about that time, I had a friend that had gone to work for Lockheed several years before when they first opened up, and he came around just about that time and said Lockheed was about to hire some more pilots. So I went up there real quick, got an interview, and they hired me into Lockheed just in time to leave Fulton County and go straight up there. One of the interesting things is when I worked at Fulton County, that's like all airports like that, 7 days, 24 hours a day almost job. And we were living in Marietta all that time, a house in Marietta. And driving back and forth every day, early in the day and late at night. Didn't get home till late at night every night. Have to close down the airport and then drive home. And Jean got tired of that. Don't blame her. I was pretty tired of it myself. And so I've been working there at Fulton County for a while. And all of a sudden, Jean drives up to the airport one day, and kids in the car get out and said, "I want to talk to you." And I said, "Okay." She said, "Well, get in the car, I'll show you." So he drove me around the corner of Fulton County Airport. Said, "I just bought this house. We're going to live here. You got to come home here tonight." That's the first I heard about it. There was a guy, a builder, building houses in this little area here, and she'd gone in there and talked to this guy and talked him into selling her a house and arranging for her a primary loan and arranging for a secondary loan with some other loan business, and providing himself, the builder, a third loan to buy the house. We didn't have a nickel in their name then, but he managed to get her and working, and she got him working and bought that house without a nickel. So then I was working at Fulton and living close by there. Now I don't remember how long that was. Only a few months before Fulton closed, and I went to LOCKHEED, and LOCKHEED was back in Marietta. So now I'm living in Atlanta and driving back and forth to LOCKHEED in Marietta, and gone all day every day anyhow. So that didn't work out so good, but I'll give her credit for getting what she wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that started. That would be in September of '55. I remember that. I went to work for LOCKHEED and stayed there then for whatever it was, 18, 20 years, with all the LOCKHEED time now in between there.
You want to take a break or anything?
No, whatever you want to talk about.
So what did Lockheed have you doing?
Well, they were building B-47s at the time, on license from Boeing, and I think Lockheed was building B-47s in Marietta, and Douglas was building B-47s in, can't remember now, anyhow, in Midwest. Can't remember the name of the factory then. And Boeing was building them. So the three different places building B-47s, because LeMay had decided and had convinced Pentagon that they needed a lot of B-47s by the time the Cold War was at the height of things then. So they wanted them all right now. So they were building B-47s as fast as they could. And so that's what we were doing at Lockheed. Lockheed, somebody at the Pentagon saw us coming, and then opened. Bell had built and operated the plant there in Marietta during the war to build B-29s. And when the war was over, they closed that down instantly. And and of course, they made, I don't remember how many B-29s they made, quite a few. I don't remember the number. And so they closed that down, and they stored a lot of the B-29s out in Powhatan, Texas, one of the dry places out there. And so when 1952, late 51, 52, when the Pentagon saw the Cold War began to heat up or cool down, whatever it does, they decided they needed to build B-47s. They decided to open that plant because it was a real good physical facility. At that time, the biggest plant in the country, biggest plant anywhere, under one roof. And so they leased, I guess, to Lockheed the plant, and it became Air Force Plant number 6, leased by Lockheed, and Lockheed started operating it, opened it up. It had been closed down from 45 to 51, and they opened it up, and open it up and train some workers, they the Pentagon arranged for them to start picking up all these old B-29s and flying back to Marietta and refurbish them, overhaul them, and that gave them something to do and learn how to rivet and fix things. So that was what was going on at first, from 51 to 55. But in the meantime, somewhere in there, probably 54, 53, 54, they had finished the B-29 lot and started taking up new B-47s and building new ones. And so when I got there, they were building B-47s. Only the B-29 was gone, thank goodness. They had a lot of trouble with that. And so B-47 was the airplane there, and stayed that way until 58, when the C-130 had been designed and built in California under a new contract, and Lockheed decided to produce it in Marietta because it was a better plan, I suppose. Or maybe Marietta needed the business when the B-47 was be closed out. So anyhow, the C-130 came along, so we started finishing the B-47s and beginning the C-130s.
You flew the B-47? So
Yeah, I flew the
B-47
for three years there.
What was your job, to flight test them after they'd been built?
Yeah.
They came off.
We had a flight operations office and board up there and cruise. Put your name on the board. You sign this number B-47 out in the front. You go out and get it and do a production flight on it. And
you were flying a plane that never flown before.
When I started there, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did that have any scary situations? You ever take off and the wheels fell off or some dumb thing like that?
Never had any trouble. Had a few what we call squawks, things go wrong, but never had any serious trouble of any kind. Pretty hard to have trouble with the engines out. I wanted to do 300 knots on 2 engines and it had 6, so it was a pretty good airplane.
Now, isn't the B-47 one of your 1,000-hour planes?
Yeah.
So that was when you built up all that time flying those.
Mm-hmm.
Would you take them somewhere on a certain route or something?
No. Lockheed was in Marietta, by Atlanta. Think of Atlanta, you know where it is. And we had basically, not quite exactly, a 300-mile radius around that. That was our FAA-approved flight test area. We didn't have any specifics other than that. Then I arranged that myself. When I went to work for Lockheed, they did not have that set at all. They were just going off and doing as they pleased. And because I had some background in the FAA, I guess I got the job of coordinating with the FAA and all the centers, ATC centers in Atlanta and Memphis and Nashville, and all who controlled that airspace. And I had to go there and tell them what we did and what altitudes we used, and find out what kind of traffic they had and where the heavy parts were and for us to stay away from type things, you know. Got all that set up and set that 300-mile radius area. The funniest part about that was in Memphis. I remember one time I was up there talking to them about it, and we said, well, we want to fly in this area. You have any traffic in there? And they said, oh, no, we don't have any traffic. You can fly in there all you want to. And we talked to the board, and they said, oh, what kind of traffic do you mean? We said, well, all traffic, airplanes, any kind of airplane. They said, oh, well, we got thousands of VFR traffic in there. And we said, well, that's traffic. And they said, yeah, I guess so. We didn't count it. And they didn't count anything but IFR. IFR was just coming in, really, in, you might say, late 40s and 50s. And there was no radar at that time or anything, you know. So we said, well, where? And they said, well, we got this Army training base down here and this one up here and where all these are. So we had to plot all those out, but they didn't. That made a big impression on me. I said, you got any traffic? No, no traffic. How about VFR? Oh, yeah, we got a lot of that. It's like it wouldn't kill you if you ran into one of those. But that was the beginning of the FAA's clamp down on as traffic. You know, that thing you see on TV today with how many airplanes are flying in the U.S.? Mm-hmm. They showed that in those days. There wouldn't have been a green dot in 2 or 3 places over the country. There just wasn't that much traffic, you know. We didn't have any criteria for flying, no altitude restrictions, except below 18,000. In any of those areas, if we were below 18 and wanted to go above, we had to file IFR with the ATC Center, Atlanta or Memphis or Nashville or whoever. But that wasn't any problem to us. We would file a flight plan before we left Lockheed, and it'd be on file when we got up to the altitude. We had to work our way up to altitude, and a lot of tests to do on the way up, and then when we got ready, we'd cross 18 going up. At that time, there was no jet traffic, of course. The Boeing 707 had not come along yet, and Learjet had not flown yet, so we were about the only jet traffic there was. So if we got to 18, we didn't have to look out anymore. There wasn't anybody else up there but us. We could talk on our own frequency, our own airplanes, and have the sky to ourselves. this kind of sky today, and a few wispy clouds here and there was our home ground in those days. They were very wonderful flying days. I can remember so many get the old B-47s rolling, as they say, steaming along, and go through cloud layers, and come out on top, and beautiful clear, and go through another few cloud layers and get on up there.
So as a check pilot, or whatever that was called,
Our job was titled Production Test Pilot.
okay.
Lockheed also had engineering test pilots, as most companies did
Right.
in those days. They
And
had,
those pilots would fly and go back to the engineers and say, you need to make the rudder bigger or do this or that. Did you have any feedback to the
No.
engineering?
not in the pilot's room. That's just flight operations now. Flight operations has production test pilots, engineering test pilots. And the engineers, what you say, tell the rudder to make the rudder bigger.
Well, I mean, they might come back and say it's not stable around the roll axis or
Yeah.
something like that. Which might have, then they would go back and work on it.
That's engineering.
Right.
That's engineering. And even then, there were largely engineering judgments in the area, like you're talking about, the real qualities of the airplane. The engineering test pilot reported on those things, but it really didn't have anything to do with it. They had engineers, aerodynamic engineers, who designed the airplanes
Yeah.
and would provide, for instance, if this flight on this airplane had to have some kind of specific test for the size of the rudder, or it hadn't been working good and they changed it, then the non-flying engineer set a program on paper. We want to do this, this is what we want to look at, and so forth. Then he wrote out what he called a flight test card, and he wrote on there, number one, do this, do this, do this, and this. This is what we want, this is what we're trying to find out. And he handed that card to the engineering test pilot. The engineering test pilot could then talk with him and find out any questions he had about what to do, about what they wanted here. But he just took that card and took the airplane and took off and answered their questions. He didn't do the aerodynamic engineer's work.
Okay. And he probably, of course, I worded it wrong. He wouldn't have provided a solution. He would have just said it's unstable around the yaw
Not
axis.
normally, but when you read Tony LeVere's book and Fish Salmon and Bob Hoover and those people, and that guy, that book I loaned you, what was his name? I can't think of his name now, but you remember the book.
Mm-hmm.
Those people got experienced enough to where their advice was listened to, and they did, I don't know, I wouldn't say frequently, but occasionally actually come up with help or suggestions. I don't know, not very much, but sometimes they did. What they did, those engineering test pilots did, were first flights and dangerous flights. Like, I can't remember the civilian test pilots of those days, but anyhow, they sometimes got a couple of $100,000 a flight, and the civilian test pilot, the military test pilots like Chuck Yeager would do the same job for the Air Force and didn't get paid, but I believe Chuck Yeager said $230 a month. They were always fussing about that. But the big point, I think, in that whole area is there's a considerable separation of jobs and responsibilities through that whole development area of any airplane, from the first days to the design to the production and on through the whole history of the airplane.
Did you ever fly the B-47 in any kind of like demonstration flights or anything
No,
like that?
I never did. No, it was well established by the time I got into Lockheed.
Okay.
And some of the SAC pilots, I guess, were flying it back in. It was designed in, I guess, first flew in '47. You know, it'd been there a long time, and I guess mass production from the three factories started in either '49 or something like that. And SAC had a bundle of them by '50s, and a lot of people have been flying them, and all that type of thing. Those really early days was all settled by then.
How did you like the plane?
Oh, it was wonderful. If I could have one of my private airplane, I'd take it. It was just a pure pleasure flying. Just such a beautiful airplane.
Huh. Yeah.
Up to then, remember, we never seen a swept wing on an airplane,
Right.
and so it was really something.
And it was a small cockpit like a fighter instead of a
Yeah, it had the canopy with pilot and co-pilot, bicycle gear and swept wing. 6 jet engines and JATO on the mount on the side.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, it was, you had about everything. You had a tail gun.
But it was not hard to handle.
Not for me.
Was
And
good.
for all these SAC pilots, probably not, although they had some accidents over the years, but we didn't have any trouble.
What
with
was
it
the
there.
trick to landing that bicycle gear? That probably took a little different procedure, didn't it?
Certainly, it was brand new, yeah. You had to land absolutely at an angle, like I was talking about ditching in the water, you had to get the right angle. B-47, you had to get the right angle so the two wheels are the same height. If you let the back wheel hit first and the nose flop down, the airplane was a little bit fragile. It'd shake the engines, come right off, they just fall off.
Huh.
And if you landed on the nose wheel, like any tri-gear airplane, you can do what's called wheel bearing. The back end can begin to do this, but as soon as the fin and rudder lose aerodynamic, well, it can wander, and there's no wheel on the ground to keep it straight. So it was very dangerous to let it ever start that. You could just turn all the way around and crash sideways.
So what you
That
wanted
happened
to
a lot.
do was make basically a 2-point landing then, huh?
Yeah, and the main 2 points had to be the right 2 points.
Yeah.
We lost, when I was at Lockheed, we lost one pilot in an accident. It was because, I'll say it's the Air Force civilian controversy. As Lockheed pilots, civilian pilots, we had to get hired on and get checked out as co-pilot by Lockheed, and then when we got ready to be checked out as pilot, the Lockheed pilot would check us out first, and then we had to fly with an Air Force pilot. And I might say just to double check. And one time an Air Force pilot was flying with one of our new pilots, and I don't need to go into details of that. They did a go around, a landing and a go around, and started roll off to the right, and just kept rolling and rolled right into the ground. The Air Force pilot had cut the outboard engine on the right side, and our pilot either didn't do the right thing, or the engine didn't catch up and tried to put power on it, or something else happened. We don't really know why it shouldn't have happened, no logical reason for it, but it did. And the bad news is that when it rolled into the ground, it was still right on the airport there, it wasn't very far from the runway, and there was a little lake there, and it slid on that bank and wiped this wing off, and the fuselage, this other wing, slid right down the side of that little lake and stopped. And the two pilots in there were talking on the radio to the tower and talking to each other back and forth, and the Air Force fire trucks screamed up there and turned their foam guns on and covered the whole airplane, keep fire down, and smothered the two pilots.
Oh no. They were alive, but they were smothered by the foam. Wow.
Because these fire truck guys just didn't pay attention to what they're doing. They're just frantic and panicked.
Yeah.
I saw the same thing almost happen to me, you might say, one time when I was flying with a CAP colonel. He's a CAP because he was Air Force, but he was assigned to the CAP as a liaison officer for Georgia, and he had a twin beach that he could fly. And I was flying around with him one time, and we were landing at Dobbins, and the gear didn't go down. It went down partly. Twin beach gear comes down like this, like a DC-3 from the back, and it went down about halfway and stuck, and couldn't get it down. So we talked and decided to land with that and just shut the engines off and get the prop straight across so they wouldn't hit, and try to keep the tail down, keep it there without it so it wouldn't damage the airplane. And we did. He landed and did a good job, and it rolled along, and you could still use the brakes. The wheels were on the ground, and we stopped just fine. And the tail was beginning to kind of lift up a little bit. It was awful light, and he jumped out of the seat and ran back there to keep the weight on the tail. And by that time the fire trucks came on, the door was on the right side, left side, I'm sorry, on this side. And he was in there, and they came up, and he opened that door, and just as he opened the door, they turned that foam thing on and just smashed him back into the airplane, covered the whole inside of the airplane with foam. And
you were still inside?
I was still up in the cockpit, and I was beginning to wonder how I was going to get out. And about that time they saw what was going on, I guess got a little smarter and turned it off, and I had to wade through that stuff and get out there and help him get out, and we both got out. fussed pretty bad at the fire people, but they making a difference. They had done what they were supposed to do, they thought.